The valley of the Piave River in northeastern Italy had always been a quiet place, defined by the slow rhythms of alpine life, the tolling of church bells, and the shadowed peaks of the Dolomites. By the autumn of 1963, the town of Longarone was a thriving community of nearly 2,000 people. They had hotels, cafes, a bustling town square, and a deep connection to the steep, forested mountains that boxed them in. Just upstream, hidden behind a narrow limestone gorge, stood a monument to modern human ambition. The Vajont Dam was a breathtaking piece of engineering. At 860 feet tall, it was the highest double-curved arch dam in the world. Its concrete face was elegant, sweeping, and impossibly thin, holding back a massive reservoir of deep green water. For the engineers who built it, the dam was a triumph over nature. For the people of Longarone living directly below it, it was a constant, looming presence. But on the night of October 9, 1963, the people of Longarone did not die because the dam failed. In fact, the Vajont Dam performed exactly as it was designed to. It held its ground perfectly. What failed was the mountain itself, and the human judgment that believed a mountain could be tamed. To understand how an entire town was erased in a matter of minutes, you have to look back to the years immediately following the Second World War. Italy was rapidly industrializing, desperate for energy to fuel its economic miracle. The solution was white coal, hydroelectric power. The Société Adriatica di Elettricità, or SADA, was a private monopoly with immense political power. SADI's lead engineer, Carlo Semenza, had a vision to harness the Piave River basin by building a network of dams, with the Vajont Gorge serving as the crown jewel. The gorge seemed like the perfect location. It was narrow, with steep rock walls that could anchor a massive concrete arch. But the valley had a secret, one recorded in the very name of the mountain that loomed over the reservoir's southern edge. The locals called it Monte Toc. In the local dialect, Toc translates roughly to rotten, or the walking mountain. For generations, shepherds had noticed that the slopes of Monte Toc were prone to shifting, cracking, and shedding rocks. When construction began in 1957, these local legends were dismissed by SADI's executives as the superstitions of uneducated farmers. The engineers relied on their own geological surveys, which initially declared the valley walls perfectly stable. But as the concrete rose higher and the valley was prepared to be flooded, the mountain began to speak for itself. In 1959, an independent geological review found serious anomalies on Monte Toc. More alarmingly, Carlo Semenza's own son, Eduardo, a brilliant geologist, discovered evidence of a massive, ancient landslide on the slope. He realized that a colossal slab of the mountain, millions of cubic meters of rock, was resting on a weak layer of clay. If the reservoir was filled, the water would seep into that clay, lubricating it. The mountain would inevitably slide into the lake. Despite these warnings, the project had too much momentum, and far too much money was at stake. SAID had secured funding and government backing, and halting the project would have been a financial disaster. Furthermore, the Italian electricity sector was on the verge of being nationalized. SAID needed the dam operational and full of water to ensure a maximum buyout price from the government. So, in early 1960, they began to fill the reservoir. Almost immediately, Monte Toc reacted. A deep, miles-long tension crack opened up along the mountainside, tracing the exact outline of the ancient landslide Eduardo Semenza had warned about. Trees tilted at strange angles. Roads buckled. In November of 1960, as the water level rose, a chunk of the mountain collapsed into the lake, sending a 7-foot wave crashing against the dam. This should have been the moment the project was abandoned. Instead, the engineers decided they could play a game of hydraulic tug-of-war with the mountain. They believed that by slowly raising and lowering the water level in the reservoir, they could control the speed of the landslide, gently easing the rock down into the water over the course of years until it stabilized. It was an act of staggering hubris. They built a bypass tunnel on the opposite side of the valley, just in case the landslide blocked the reservoir, and then they continued their deadly experiment. For the next 2 years, the people of Longarone lived beneath a ticking time bomb. Local journalists, most notably a reporter named Tina Merlin, wrote passionate articles warning that Sadie was risking the lives of thousands. She interviewed locals whose land was physically moving beneath their feet, their fences drifting several feet a month. For her efforts, Sadie sued Merlin for spreading false news and causing public unrest. She was eventually acquitted, but the government sided with the power company. The warnings were suppressed, and the filling of the reservoir continued. By late summer of 1963, the water in the reservoir was pushed to its maximum legal limit, nearly 800 feet deep. The engineers were trying to complete the final testing phase before handing the dam over to the newly formed National Energy Agency. But Montauk was moving faster than ever. Instead of creeping at a few millimeters a day, the landslide was moving by centimeters and then by inches. By early October, the signs of impending catastrophe were undeniable. The mountain was groaning. Animals refused to graze on the slopes. The water in the town wells turned muddy as the shifting bedrock warped the aquifers. SAID engineers finally realized they had lost control. In a panic, they began to rapidly drain the reservoir, hoping that lowering the water level would relieve the pressure and stop the mountain from moving. But it was a fatal miscalculation. As the water drained away, it left the heavily saturated clay layer deep inside the mountain unsupported. The friction holding millions of tons of rock in place was gone. On the evening of October 9th, the town of Longarone was settling in for the night. The cafes were crowded with men watching a highly anticipated European Cup football match between Real Madrid and Rangers on the few televisions in town. The night was unseasonably calm. There was no rain, and the sky above the Dolomites was clear. Up at the dam, the engineers were nervous, but not panicked. They had ordered the road across the top of the dam closed, and a few observation crews were stationed on the abutments to monitor the mountain's movement. They expected the landslide to happen, but they believed it would be a slow, manageable collapse. At 10:39 p.m., the mountain let go. It was not a slow collapse. An entire slab of Montauk, measuring over a mile wide and a mile deep, detached from the bedrock. 260 million cubic meters of earth, rock, and forest, a mass larger than the reservoir itself, accelerated down the slope at 60 miles per hour. The sound was deafening, a low, rumbling roar that survivors later compared to the sound of 1,000 freight trains or the tearing of the sky itself. The landslide hit the water in less than 45 seconds. When a mass of that size enters a confined body of water, the water has nowhere to go but up. The impact generated a displacement wave of unimaginable proportions. A solid wall of water, mud, and pulverized rock surged upwards, reaching a terrifying height of 820 feet above the crest of the dam. For a brief, suspended moment, a mountain of water hung in the night sky, blocking out the moon. Then it fell. Half of the wave surged upstream, obliterating several small villages along the shores of the lake. But the main force of the wave crashed directly over the top of the Vajont Dam, plunging into the narrow, winding gorge below. As the water plummeted hundreds of feet down the canyon, it gained terrifying speed and compressed the air in front of it. Before the water even reached the valley floor, it pushed a supersonic shockwave of displaced air ahead of it. This blast of wind hit Longarone first. It was so powerful that it snapped mature trees like matchsticks, shattered windows, and literally stripped the clothes off people who had stepped outside to see what the noise was. Buildings were crushed by the wind before they ever felt the dampness of the flood. A fraction of a minute later, the water arrived. It was no longer just water. It was a churning slurry of mud, boulders, shattered trees, and the twisted metal of the construction facilities from the dam site. It hit the Piave Valley with the force of an atomic blast. The wave was estimated to be nearly 230 feet high when it struck Longarone. It did not simply flood the town, it erased it. The immense pressure and velocity of the water scoured the valley floor down to the bedrock. Concrete buildings were pulverized into dust. The church, which had stood for centuries, simply vanished. The water surged across the valley, rebounding off the opposite mountainside, before finally rushing violently downstream toward the Adriatic Sea. From the moment the mountain collapsed to the moment Longarone was destroyed, less than 4 minutes had passed. When dawn broke the next morning, the rescue crews that arrived from nearby military bases and neighboring towns could not comprehend what they were seeing. They had been told that Longarone had been flooded. But there was no Longarone. There were no ruins to search, no rooftops poking above the water, no streets to navigate. There was only a vast, flat expanse of gray, steaming mud, littered with pale, stripped boulders. The valley had been scrubbed clean. Of the nearly 2,000 residents of Longarone and the surrounding hamlets, fewer than 30 survived. Entire bloodlines were extinguished. The recovery effort was a grim, almost impossible task. Many of the victims were never found, washed miles downstream, or buried beneath dozens of feet of compacted sediment. But perhaps the most chilling sight of all awaited the rescuers when they looked upstream toward the gorge. High above the valley of mud, catching the morning light, stood the Vajont Dam. It was perfectly intact. The wave had washed away the guardrails and a few feet of masonry at the very top, but the structure itself had not cracked. The engineers had built a masterpiece. It had withstood a force exponentially greater than anything it was designed to hold. The aftermath of the disaster brought a wave of national outrage. The suppression of the journalists, the ignored geological reports, and the sheer arrogance of Sadie became a massive scandal. In the ensuing criminal trials, several engineers and government officials were convicted of manslaughter and negligence, though the sentences were light, and the legal battles dragged on for decades. Carlos Semenza, the visionary behind the dam, had died of natural causes just 2 years before the disaster, escaping the horror of seeing his life's work become an instrument of mass death. Today, the Vajont Dam still stands, bridging the gap of the gorge. It has never been used to generate a single watt of electricity since that night in 1963. The reservoir behind it is mostly filled with the sheer rock face of Monte Toc, exactly where the mountain came to rest. It remains as one of the most haunting monuments on Earth, a flawless marvel of human engineering, entirely useless, standing silently over a valley that paid the ultimate price for human arrogance.